Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Amazing Podcast. It's great to have you with us. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazing, and we bring you all things cloud native. It's what we love, it's what we are passionate about, and not just this podcast, but we do a lot more at our website, which is amazic.com. Go and check it out. We've got articles and job listings and event coverage, a lot of interesting stuff that you'd love there. Um, and for today's episode, I have with me someone who's familiar. We've had him before this once, but it's been almost a year. And so, he tipped me off that something big just dropped at his startup. And so I thought, why not have him over and get him to tell us about it. So I have with me Alex Olivier, who is the co-founder and chief product officer at Cerbos. Alex, it's great to have you with us again. Welcome back.
Hey, good to see you again. Yes, thank you again for having me. Really enjoyed our discussion last time and everything cloud native. So we're definitely keen to speak to you about the latest and greatest in the authorization space and what we've been up to at Cerbos.
Yeah. You guys are a really exciting time because you're quite early stage, right? And this is, you're probably it's been open source. You have an open source foundation, and now
Yes.
building out your product around this. It's a really exciting phase in the journey for Cerbos, right? Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. We have been around for a few years now. We open sourced the core engine of Cerbos, the Cerbos Policy Decision Point, Cerbos PDP. That's an open source project. Go and grab it off GitHub, Apache license. We're a CNCF member as well. And that's really the core engine of Cerbos. And that's what's been used to this day by companies large and small, ranging from early stage startups through to multi-billion-dollar publicly listed companies are using Cerbos to manage their authorization space. And then what we've been up to for the last good year, really, is building out Cerbos Hub, which we announced at KubeCon in Europe last year in Amsterdam. And then we opened up access to anyone that wanted to try it at KubeCon in North America in last November in Chicago. So it's been a really busy year for Cerbos and kind of growing the company, both the open source project and the product that sits on top, this kind of commercial open source model. It's been a lot of work, but a lot of fun, and we're really excited to get more users on board and helping them rationalize their authorization in their systems.
Yeah, sounds like a really exciting year for you. It's probably kept you really busy, like you were saying. Yeah, and have there been a lot of iterations, a lot of new features getting added along the way? Because you had seemed like a gradual rollout.
Mm.
Have there been a lot of new things added that kind of might have surprised you at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've kind of got this sort of two tracks. We have the open source project, Cerbos Policy Decision Point, and that's kind of been a constant iteration, both by our team here at Cerbos, but also anyone out there. And we're very lucky to have a very vibrant and active community around the project. So we've had contributions from users, our own teams, lots of discussion and input in both our GitHub issues for that, but also our Slack community. So the core of Cerbos has actually been extended and iterated on a fair bit in the last year. So there's been new capabilities added. I think one to highlight, which was really driven by the community, is the concept of policy outputs. So just to kind of recap for our discussion from last time, for those that may not have heard it, so Cerbos is an engine that allows you to define your authorization logic as policy rather than the code. So your policies define, here are the default, here are the different resource kinds in my application. So users, expenses, documents, assets, whatever your application models. And then in that policy, which in the Cerbos open source project is a YAML file, very easy to read, love it or hate it, it's YAML. You define the different actions that a user can do or a principal can do upon those resource types, and then under which conditions. So you must have a certain role or for your typical RBAC or role-based access control model, but where the power of Cerbos comes in is writing conditions for attribute-based access control. So a user can edit a resource only if they are the owner of it, for example. And that's where you have a condition that checks whether the user's ID is equal to the owner ID attribute of the resource. So that was kind of those policies gave you kind of a Boolean answer. So this action should be allowed or not. And one of the kind of big discussion points in the Slack community and the GitHub as well is like, well, what if I need more than just a Boolean allow deny? What if I want to provide some context about why an action was either allowed or denied? Because let's say you wanted to present a friendly error message or a friendly sort of prompt to a user based on your policy. So we added the concept of policy outputs. And again, that was driven by the community, kind of worked on collaboratively. So now, along with defining whether an action should be allowed or not, you can actually construct an output. And that could be a string, it could be an integer, it could be whatever you want from JSON. You can define it in your policy. So when Cerbos gives you your application an answer, either allow or deny, it also brings along that output. And to give you kind of a tangible example of that is, let's say you want some actions to only be allowed if you've had a two-factor authentication. Say you're like a bank system. We have a lot of fintech users of Cerbos. Let's say you only want to allow a user to make a transfer to another bank account if they've done a second factor authentication in the last 10 minutes. Well, one of the attributes you have about user is when did they last do their 2FA? So that's a timestamp. In your policy, you can say, okay, this action shouldn't be allowed if that timestamp was in the last 10 minutes. And if it's denied, and if the answer is denied, you want to actually return back to the user saying it's denied because your 2FA is kind of stale, and maybe you want to tell your application to go and send the user off to go and revalidate their session. So that's the power of using outputs rather than just giving you a binary answer. It actually gives you the context for why an action was either allowed or denied.
Wow. Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's like a really good detailed, actually, explanation of what Cerbos Hub does, and covered a lot of ground in that response. But I want to kind of break it down a bit and dig into pieces of what you just explained. And I want to just start off with talking about just some of the challenges with doing all of this the manual way and the usual way. What are the challenges with authorization? What's Cerbos Hub trying to actually solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So every application at the point where you have more than one user or one user role, you're going to have to handle authorization. So just to go back to basics, authentication and authorization are two different concepts. Unfortunately, they're going to get reduced these days to just auth N and auth Z, and even that is a bit confusing. So authentication is about prompting the user to present a credential and then verifying that credential, and you get an identity. So, and your classic log in with your GitHub account, and you get back an identity from the GitHub OAuth flow that says, okay, this person is Alex Olivier, this person is Twain Taylor, etc. The second piece is, okay, once you know who a user is, what can they actually do inside of your application? And that's where authorization comes in, auth Z. And this is the logic that generally is going to be sprinkled across your code base traditionally, and this is certainly where I started, where you have like your request handler and say your API, and you want to make sure that only this particular API route or this particular API action, it can be called if someone is authenticated and they have the role of manager, let's say. So somewhere in your code base, there's going to be an if statement that says, if user.role includes manager, then allow, if not, return some sort of error.
Yeah.
And for simple apps, simple applications, simple logic, absolutely fine, just go and run with that. But from kind of my experience and the rest of our team's experience of building these systems at multiple companies, from Google, Microsoft, Elastic, all sorts of kind of experience in our team, that logic is never a simple if statement. There's always going to be a lot of fine-grained business logic encoded in it. And I'm sure you can imagine from kind of stuff you've built, how hairy and how complex that kind of code becomes. You end up with basically a big ball of mud or spaghetti code trying to work out what actually should be allowed or not. So Cerbos is an answer to that problem, which is, okay, let's take all that complicated business logic, which is going to be spread out across all across your code base, and extract it out into a standalone component inside of your stack. And Cerbos is that component, is the policy decision point. And what that now means is your application code, rather than have to hard code all that logic, which let's say you're a microservices and your services are in different languages, whenever the business logic changes, you're going to have to rewrite that logic in n number of languages that say you have in your stack. Cerbos is now just an API. So in your application code, rather than hard coding the logic, you just make an API call out to a Cerbos instance, which for the open source project is a container. It's literally a service that runs in your stack. Cerbos Hub, we actually make that a lot easier. We actually generate a WebAssembly module, which you can essentially embed inside of your application. We can come onto that later. But ultimately, there's a point in your stack now, which is the source of truth for authorization logic. And any part of your application can call for that, saying, I have this user or principal trying to do this action on this resource. That Cerbos decision point, be it the actual container or the WASM version, will evaluate your policies, which you define as that YAML I mentioned earlier, and simply return back and allow or deny with that optional output. And then in your code base, it's now a simple if statement. If Cerbos says allow, do the action. If not, return some sort of error. So the core problem we're solving here is that complex business logic that's generally scattered across your code base and extracting out into a standalone piece, which is versionable, auditable, testable, and ultimately verifiable inside of your stack.
All right. Yeah, it sounds interesting. And policies at the heart of it. And you mentioned a lot of these ideas around policies, ABAC particularly. And yeah, it sounds really interesting. But as you're kind of working on the product, could you kind of shed some light on the journey of getting to what Cerbos Hub looks like right now? What are some of the design decisions that went into making it the way it is today? Or if I put it another way, what were some of the decisions that you made that said, no, we're not going to do it this way, even though some people may think this is the right way to do authorization. Instead, we're going to take this route. And that probably makes what makes Cerbos Hub unique itself. Could you share some background on that, the whole process of just coming up the product is today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we saw from our usage, a couple of years worth of usage of the open source project, how Cerbos is used as a decision point. And we've seen this, as I said, from like small startups to massive enterprise businesses are using Cerbos today in production, handling millions and millions and millions of authorization checks a day through Cerbos instances. And so talking to those users and seeing how they've set up and deployed their systems, their pipelines, their architectures to basically take advantage of Cerbos, we started to come across kind of a few areas where things were a bit, let's say, more verbose or painful to actually operationalize at scale using Cerbos. And this is where we started on the journey of Cerbos Hub. It's like, how can we essentially give you a suite of tools, an offering, a full kind of ecosystem of support that builds on top of that core model and gives you things that make the operational burden of running a scalable authorization system sort of lessen the burden, as it were, and something that gives you something that's far more scalable and approachable to use. And particularly, we're looking at this from the aspect of the people that own authorization in the business is not the developer doing the code. It's going to be that product person. It's going to be the CISO. It's going to be even in some cases like the customer team that kind of worry about the authorization side of things. And these aren't people that are going to be living in the code base. These aren't going to be people that will know Java or Go or Rust or whatever your code base is in. So we wanted to come up with a solution that kind of sits on top of the core, but then gives a collaborative platform and a collaborative environment to have the relevant people inside of the business use authorization. And the way we kind of look at this is authorization should always run inside of your environment. What you don't want to do is have something like cloud-hosted API thing that your application has to call over the internet to make an authorization decision. That is going to be bad for performance. Because unlike authentication, which is like a one-off task and you get a token that's valid for, say, 30 minutes, authorization, you have to check on every single API call. And if you're going to go out over the internet to some cloud-hosted API, et cetera, to make an authorization check, you're going to add N number of milliseconds to every single call, which from an architecture perspective is obviously not recommended. So the way we designed and architected, and one of the key decisions we made with Cerbos Hub is a managed control plane that sits on top of the open core. So architecturally, the decision points are still running inside of your cluster or inside of your architecture, inside of your ecosystem, wherever you're running it, but they connect out to Cerbos Hub in order to get their configuration. So Cerbos Hub is a managed control plane, but it's not the data plane if you were to use that terminology at all. So we did a lot of work to get that synchronization and that connection in a way that is scalable, is a way that's performant, but most importantly, it's not involved at all in the actual decision making. That happens still locally inside of your cluster, inside of your environment.
Interesting. I found interesting what you spoke about, that authorization needs to happen natively, and it can't be hosted somewhere in the cloud. And I want to just dig in to ask about what does that mean in terms of implementation, especially for you, building a product with this idea. What are some of the of building Cerbos Hub to run natively, and you were hinting at even WASM. So if you
Yeah.
could kind of write on just this whole idea of what this means and what are the challenges involved and how you made it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So keeping the core decision point inside of your network, inside of your application, is kind of the number one design decision we came to. Cerbos Hub essentially should be is and should always be an optional component that you plug in on top of the open core, the open source policy decision point. So from day one, we had to design, okay, how can we basically design the APIs for this control plane in a way that we can open source those as well. So the actual API definitions, the actual interfaces that Cerbos Hub uses to communicate to the policy decision points and vice versa, those actual APIs are public. They're in the open source repo. You can go and look at the protocol definitions. And we always took the approach that, hopefully we think Cerbos Hub is the best way of doing this, but the APIs are open, so you could actually go and build your own control plane if you wanted on top of it, which some might say is madness. We think is just kind of the right thing to do, particularly as we very much subscribe to the CNCF kind of philosophy that everything should be open, everything should be extensible, everything should be manageable by yourself. So getting that API interface right and then essentially open sourcing that, it was something that we took a lot of time over to get right, because we needed to make sure it was feature rich enough for all the capabilities we wanted to build with Cerbos Hub now and in the future, but also make sure it's sort of grokkable and understandable for anyone that did want to go and extend it themselves. So I would say is kind of the first point. The second piece was like, okay, now we have this management control plane and we have the decision points are running on stack. Like, how do we keep those two in sync, and how do we connect those? So Cerbos itself is running Go. It's that Cerbos Hub runs in Kubernetes, all that sort of stuff. The interface we naturally fell into is then gRPC. So Cerbos Hub and the pod decision points speak to each other over a bidirectional stream. So leveraging again this whole ecosystem of CNCF projects to kind of build out this whole ecosystem around Cerbos and Cerbos Hub that sits on top of it. The actual decision points themselves, they ultimately need to get one thing, which is the policies. So how do we get the policy files from wherever they are into the decision points? And for any sort of scalable or I guess, production deployment of Cerbos or an application, you're never going to have a single instance of Cerbos. You're going to need that high availability. You're going to need multiple instances. And actually with Cerbos, going back to that performance piece, you actually want to run Cerbos as close to your application as possible. So the approach we always recommend is a sidecar if you're in Kubernetes. So you literally run a Cerbos instance alongside every application instance that you're running. That means you now have the synchronization problem. If you have 5 instances of your app running, you're going to have 5 instances of Cerbos running. How do you make sure those 5 instances of Cerbos are running the same version of the policy? And this is one of those operational points that we've heard from users over and over again. It's like, Cerbos is good, it's working, it does what it says in the tin, but whenever I have to push a policy change out, each instance of Cerbos in my application has to go and fetch its policy separately. So with Cerbos Hub, we flip that on the head. So Cerbos Hub ultimately at its core is a CI/CD pipeline, and the CD part of that is the component which synchronizes the rollout of policy changes. So whenever there's a policy change, you push that to your own repo, which you own and control. Cerbos Hub is connected to that repo, gets the webhook from GitHub, let's say, that says, hey, there's a new commit. Cerbos Hub picks up that change, runs the CI, so it'll run any tests that are going on. If all the tests pass, it will then compile a pre-optimized and pre-compiled version of your policies. So that is basically a binary representation of your policy files, and then notifies all the connected Cerbos PDP instances that, hey, there's a new version of your policies available. And then that gets pushed down to all the instances and synchronizes the rollout and change. So what you actually get using Cerbos Hub, along with Cerbos Policy Decision Point, is a far more consistent set of policies across your architecture. So whenever there's a new build, all your Cerbos Hub, all your Cerbos instances will get that update, and your application thus will serve a consistent authorization decision, regardless of how it's deployed and set up.
Really cool. Yeah, it sounds very interesting that you spoke about how you implemented it in the CI/CD pipeline model. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Maybe we'll dig into a bit of that later. But for now, I was wondering if you could actually give us a little walkthrough or glimpse of Cerbos Hub in action. Take the covers off, show us the product itself and what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just share my screen here. So I'm actually going to start off with a diagram. I think for sort of anyone that's in this space, we don't like doing slides, etc. We like to kind of talk a bit more concrete things how things work, and again, make sure you get the architecture right in your head is kind of a key one of those. So architecturally, this is ultimately how Cerbos works. Cerbos and Cerbos Hub works together. So on your left here, you have your end users. So these are in your client applications, be it a mobile app or web app, etc. And they're interacting with your API. So requests are going from your client to your API layer. Your API layer could be essentially anything. Cerbos is agnostic to any particular deployment or architecture. But at some point, you're going to have some service which is going to handle a particular request that comes in. So that app service, based on the request, really knows two things. Firstly, that request is going to be authenticated, most likely, so you know the user's identity, be it you have a JWT token, or you can go out to an IDP provider, Auth0, Cognito, super tokens, whatever you're using for authentication, and you can go and fetch back from that IDP the details about the user. So what team they're in, what roles they're in, what organization they belong to. You might have an actual directory like a Active Directory or an LDAP or those kind of things to get that further context. Second thing you know based on that request is what resource that user is trying to access. So they're trying to view a report, they're trying to edit a invoice, they're trying to export a purchase order, let's say. Again, that's all kind of business specific. But your application database obviously stores that information about the resources. So you can go and query your database to go and fetch that particular resource. Now, at that point, going back to what I was saying earlier, traditionally, you'd write a massive if-else case switch style statement to work out whether an action should be allowed or not. Using Cerbos, instead, you run and deploy a Cerbos policy decision point alongside your application. So in your app service, you now make an API call out, either directly or via one of our SDKs, and you send a request to that local instance running alongside your application, saying, I got this principal, because it could be a user, it could be an API service account, for example, trying to do this action on this particular resource. These Cerbos policy decision point instances will then have into them loaded into the policy, and those policies will be evaluated. It will then create a log. So every policy decision point, you set up where you want to send the logs to, standard out to be picked up by your log collection system is a good example of typically where they go. We have support for other backends, Kafka being one that was added by the community recently. And it will create a log entry that says, at this time, this user tried to do this action on this resource, and it was either allowed or denied by this particular policy. So then what comes back to your application is either an allow or deny decision, if you're simply asking for what we call the check permissions, or you get what we call a query plan. So Cerbos has a kind of a unique capability, which is what we call kind of the sorting or the listing or the index problem. So one of the issues when you decouple authorization logic out into a standalone service is how do you filter your database results based on permissions when the permissions are going to be dynamic based on policy? So what Cerbos has is something called a plan resources or a query planner capability, where you can say to Cerbos, I have this user trying to do this action on this kind of resource. Then what happens inside of the policy engine is rather than it returning a Boolean, it works out which conditions need to be met for that particular action to be allowed by this particular user. So what you now get back is the smallest set of conditions possible for you to apply to your data fetching logic to return just the records from your database. Let's say that user, that those conditions would need to be met for that action to be allowed. So what that gives you is essentially a where clause that you pass into your SQL query or whatever you're using, which is dynamic based on your policies. And thus what the query you can then run will return just the records that user would have that permission to access. So that's kind of the two types of response you get from Cerbos. And that's all part of the core open source project. If you just need that, go and use it. You go and use Cerbos policy decision point, the open source project. You never need to talk to us. Where Cerbos Hub comes in is that layer on top of it, the management control plane. So in this environment, we try and represent by these boxes at least that you have a cluster, you have replicas, you might have some on-prem, you might have some cloud, you might have some edge compute, etc. which now means you have to do authorization in lots of different places, be it it's just a replica or actually maybe you're in a completely different environment, but you need to make sure the permission checks are the same. And that's where Cerbos Hub comes in. So Cerbos Hub primarily is this control plane. You connect Cerbos Hub to your policy store. So a GitHub repo being the most kind of common and most obvious one, and the one that's supported today. So you'd have a repo that, again, you own and control. This is yours. You should keep it. You should keep it safe. You should exist in your org. We're not forcing you to use any other storage. You authenticate Cerbos Hub to your GitHub repo via a GitHub app we have. And now Cerbos Hub is basically wired up to run a CI pipeline whenever there's a commit to your repo. So the core of Cerbos Hub is it gets that commit hook, commits a change. Cerbos Hub then runs the tests. It creates an optimized format binary, and then if the tests pass and if the conditions are met, it will then go and push out that change to all the Cerbos instances, regardless of where they are running. So it could be in a Kubernetes cluster, it could be some edge somewhere, it could be in your on-prem. Doesn't really matter as long as they're all connected, or as long as your Cerbos Hub instances are connected to the policy decision points. Those real-time updates are going to flow through and keep everything in sync. The kind of benefits here are everything's now in sync, but we also then inside of Cerbos Hub give you this kind of collaborative environment. So you can actually work and iterate and evolve your policies in an interactive playground, which I'll show you in a second, which is a fully sort of collaborative IDE that you can use to manage and evolve your policies. So that's the core of Cerbos Hub. So you may be wondering what this other line is, and this lovely WebAssembly logo, which I promise is not us just jumping on the hype of WebAssembly. Amazing technology. But for Cerbos, we actually there's a real kind of use case for authorization for using WASM and WebAssembly technologies.
Yeah.
So as part of the CI pipeline, Cerbos Hub also produces a secondary output, as well as the policies that go to your containers, into the instances running in your architecture. Cerbos Hub also generates a WASM module of your policy logic. So there's essentially a second runtime for evaluating your Cerbos policies. One is the PDP service that's running in your stack. The second one is this WASM module. So Cerbos Hub, again, runs a test, makes sure your policy is valid, and then also produces a WASM module, which we then push out to a CDN. And what that now means is you can start putting your policy files and essentially embed the authorization logic into an edge function, or pull even directly onto the client via web browser, mobile app, etc. And there's a whole group of authorization checks that we kind of call like presentational or UI type authorization logic, which you don't need to require a full round trip to a backend and such to do. Classic example is, let's say you're like showing a user a form to edit some resource, and that user's, what they're allowed to do to that resource is varied based on your policies. So you want to show or hide fields, or disable or enable buttons, or show or hide menu items based on the resource. At that point, the resource is actually already loaded into the client because you pulled it back from your API. You've done the server-side check to make sure that user can access that resource. So the content, basically the JSON blob or whatever, is now back on the client. But now you actually want to conditionally render components on the page. That doesn't really necessarily necessitate a call back to your backend to then call Cerbos and then that full round trip. So what you can do is then, using the exact same SDKs, rather than hitting a server-side PDP version of Cerbos, you pull in that WASM module, and then all the evaluation is done on device or at edge, and sample in an edge function. So it's going to be super fast because it's essentially all local or on the edge. And you're getting the exact same response format, response type into your application. So those show and hide logic, those allow denies, will happen directly on device. Far more snappy, save the load on your backend. But the key thing here is the policies are always synchronized with what the policies are that are running in your backend as well, because Cerbos Hub is managing that CI for you and then coordinating the rollout and the push out of both the decision points running in your backend, as well as pushing out the update to the WASM module that's sitting on a CDN, so your clients can then pull that in and start authorizing with the latest and greatest version of your policies, and so it's consistent everywhere. And WASM is the technology that really allows it, because WASM you can run basically anywhere these days.
Okay. Wow, very cool. Sounds like there's a big focus on just performance, especially you're talking about how, it seems that there's this metadata kind of thing that you have something indexed where, policies are kind of abstracted. And I like what you spoke about where, Cerbos Hub looks for the bare minimum policies that need to be met for someone to have access to a resource. That was really interesting. And I think those kind of things are what really add up to making performance really, low latency and real time, and no matter where it is, like you were mentioning, even on the edge, it could be on a device, and you still need that performance. And these are the kind of things that really make that possible, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, performance is the heart of every decision we make with Cerbos, because we are aware, both from hard experiences learned from at scale systems. My background is managing systems that did tens of billions of requests a day through them. And there's certain architectural patterns that just break at that scale, particularly if you're trying to store state and cache things at the edge and those sort of things. They will fall down. It's a matter of when, not if. We're at that kind of the scale, and all the fun of it is eventual consistency, etc. So we've taken those lessons and we've applied it for how we built both Cerbos and Cerbos Hub for this performance piece, because authorization is going to be and has to be in the blocking path of every single request that your application is handling. So Cerbos itself needs to be as performant as possible. And it's not just us making sure our code is built sensibly, but our decisions in terms of using things like a gRPC API, because it's more performant than HTTP, is the way we've architected it. So Cerbos is completely stateless. So all the context about what your authorizing is provided in the request. Thus, Cerbos itself doesn't need to maintain state. It doesn't have its own data store or anything like that. Thus, you can actually have multiple and many versions of Cerbos running inside of your stack. Hence, you can use like the sidecar model. And that way, the network time between your application and getting your authorization decision is minimal to none, dependency how you deploy it. And then with the WASM piece as well, removing unnecessary network time completely. So actually pulling the policies directly onto device or into an edge function and those kind of things via a WASM module removes the whole need for that as well for those use cases. So again, it's all about performance, because we're just super focused on where authorization needs to be done.
Mhm. And another piece that was, I think, really stood out in your explanation in the architecture diagram was just enabling collaboration and the two-way sync that you mentioned, and just making this even possible. No matter where your application or your cluster is.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about that? And it seems like the IDE has something to do with it, and you're mentioning you give us a glimpse of the IDE as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things we kind of discovered quite early on, speaking to users of the open source project, is that it is always a collaborative journey to write your authorization logic, because the requirements again aren't just a Jira ticket. It's going to be the work of the product person responsible for the product. It's going to be work inputs from your CISO, let's say, for a security standpoint. You might have inputs from your customer team. You might even have inputs from your sales team around how access should be defined inside of a system. And so what we were generally seeing is there would be a developer, a product person, some other representative or stakeholder in the business, all sitting around writing policy together. And we always tell users to start out like just get a spreadsheet, have all your different user roles, have all your different actions, and then start by putting yes, allow or deny in each of the cells. And then you very quickly realize that actually some of these are not allow or deny, it's allow, deny, or allow or deny under certain conditions. And then you end up with basically the matrix of what permissions should be. From then, converting that into policy is actually pretty simple. But as we saw, we built Cerbos during the coronavirus years of everyone remote, etc. We are a fully remote company. We were seeing lots of users just like screen sharing their IDEs and running tests, etc. It's like, well, how can we make this a bit easier to do? And with Cerbos Hub, we have a fully collaborative IDE environment, which I can pull up an example of in a second. And basically, this is a IDE environment which is collaborative in the sense that it's a la Google Docs, where you can have multiple users working together on policies. And the Cerbos Hub playground is exactly this. So you get a very familiar kind of IDE environment, if VS Code, etc., of your policies, and these are pulling your policies from your Git repo, or you can create files directly in here. And as well as giving you this very standard code editor with all the things you expect in terms of autocomplete and snippets and such, you also get value add kind of capabilities. So as well as just giving you an IDE that gives you your policy files and having multiple users in it. So if I, for example, pull up a second window off screen here and I go into the same file, this highlighting stuff is very much like, your Google Docs style experience. You can see the different users inside of a file, etc. We also give you this side panel here, which is what we kind of call the explore panel. So as you're writing policies inside of this IDE and this side of this playground, we're also evaluating those policies based on given inputs. So as well as writing your policy logic, you can define your tests and you write fixtures for those tests. So here are my reference principles, here are my reference resources. And then Cerbos Hub, as you're editing things in your playground here, is actually evaluating those policies. So if I go and look at different resources from my fixtures, hopefully below you can see as I click between these, we're actually getting different answers and different results and different decisions. So this is the tooling that helps you, as you're collaboratively working on your policies, see the impact of those changes you're working on in real time. So I can go and change these policy files and actually now make this a deny. Now, firstly, I'm going to make a typo and say, oh, and you get that feedback that you're kind of used to of like, okay, what's wrong with my file? You get IntelliSense, all the fun stuff you're kind of used to as well. And then as you do actually make those changes, we're constantly really evaluating those inputs and giving your different actions. And the second piece we're doing is running the tests. So as well as defining your reference fixtures, you can also write your tests with your actual and expected values of whether an action should be allowed or not. And then we're evaluating running those tests as you're writing, and then you can go in and actually update your tests and such. So what we were seeing and the kind of journey we saw with users during our sort of development of this is you would have generally a developer or two working on the policies. You might have that product person sitting on or looking over the shoulder. And as you're collaboratively working on things, getting that feedback and really understanding what's going on. And then it's a very natural progression once you've got your policies, your tests, to then push it into a CI pipeline. And then with Cerbos Hub, that's where the build piece comes in. So as every time you push a commit, we're running the pipeline. If, for example, the tests fail, we give you the output of why the test failed, etc. You can drill down into that, exactly what's going on. You can jump straight to the GitHub commit. And that is both for the service version, so the container version, but also the embedded version. So that was a module. Cerbos Hub is running through the pipeline. And then when your decision points are actually out there, we give you essentially the snippets to go and integrate it into your environment. So this is an example of how you go and integrate the WASM version into a JavaScript framework. So you install a package, you point out the URL we give you, and now that application or that edge function or that client is always going to get the latest version of your policies. So it's a complete ecosystem of tooling from collaborative policy editing through to manage, build, test, deploy, and then giving you the steps to go and actually run the decision points inside of your environment or inside of it as a module. And then we'll give you the feedback as well in terms of which instances are running, how many, which version they're on, which version of the policies are deployed, etc. So it gives you the insight piece at the end also. So again, it's like a complete end-to-end way of managing and scaling your authorization logic built on top of the open source Cerbos project.
Oh, really cool. Yeah. Yeah, I think really cool. And great analogy of Google Docs as well, something we all use every day. And yeah, I think really amazing that you've taken some of those concepts and applied it here to Cerbos Hub. I want to ask about just like what about, talking about just how authorization decisions are made, if you try to bake any of that into the product as well, where because these are the actual policies, but how these policies get defined itself, there's this whole discussions behind those policies everywhere, all over the place, in person, in Jira tickets, and email, everywhere else. Any efforts or any thoughts on that? How do you capture the sort of decision process behind these policies and how they get framed? Anywhere to write notes or comments or even have discussions on particular policies, anything of that sort?
Yeah, so this is always one of those challenges when you're kind of essentially building like a workflow tool. Is like, how do you integrate into users' existing ways of working? Because we could go and build a whole, Jira type tool or a linear or whatever into Cerbos Hub, but then what's the incentive to go and use that over your existing tools if you already have a process? And particularly for someone authorization that does touch so many different parts of a business and so many different parts of an organization with various different stakeholders, you really don't have to pull people out their existing tools and existing workflows. So the way we kind of approach it, anyone that goes and uses Cerbos Hub, we kind of point them in the direction of sort of best practices, but we're not forcing you into any particular way of working until the point where you're actually taking your business logic and turning it into policy. And that's why we did invest in doing things like the collaborative editing, the actual IDE environment, the playground environment, because that's the point where you will be out of your existing, Jira, Asana, Linear, whatever you're using, and into actual implementation mode. And then that's where it kind of makes sense to give you an environment that goes beyond just giving you a code editor, but also enriches it with the tooling like you saw, where we run the tests, we give you that real-time feedback, etc. So we decided not to go down the route of like building a sort of a Trello, Asana, Linear type capability. Like, go and use your existing thing. Where it does plug in though is because Cerbos Hub keeps your policies in your existing GitHub repo, your workflow in terms of how you manage and do PRs, etc., in your development team doesn't change because it's just another repo in your existing GitHub organization. So we integrate at that point, and that way you're not locked into Cerbos Hub at any point. We even went to the point of setting it up such that if you wanted to rip out Cerbos Hub because you're fed up with it for whatever reason, hopefully you'd talk to us first rather than doing that. It's just a one-line config change in your Cerbos policy decision points to just pull the policy files directly from your GitHub and bypass Cerbos Hub. So the onboarding and offboarding is both as seamless as possible. It's literally a config change to go from Cerbos PDP pulling from GitHub to pulling it from Cerbos Hub, or vice versa. So again, it's about no lock-in. It's about making sure that we fit into your existing workflows, and it's about making sure that you are working in a much more scalable way than having to build everything yourself, when really you should be focusing on building your actual application.
Yeah, and as we're winding down, I want to touch on this topic of the CI/CD pipeline that you mentioned. Kind of also has threads of just ideas around GitOps and using just Git repositories, updating them, which is already part of your workflow. And I want to ask about rollbacks. I'm sure that it's really simple for you to roll back to a previous state in any of your policies. Could you talk a bit about that? How easy is that, and how does that work? And just anything as we wind down on just GitOps model, the CI/CD model, how that makes all of this possible.
Yeah, so Cerbos Hub is designed as GitOps, ultimately. GitHub is your Git repos, your source of truth for your authorization policies. That should always be the case. It shouldn't be some random cloud service that you're provided to that holds your truth. You should own and control everything that goes on. So Cerbos Hub is the CI/CD layer that sits on top of that source of truth and is triggered by any changes to that underlying repository. And then the bit we've added on top of that is, rather than every commit going straight out to production or whatever environment you want, you obviously don't want that, is we have the concept of deployment labels inside of Cerbos Hub. So a deployment label is a configuration file that sits alongside your policies inside of your Git repo. It's another YAML file, but this time it defines a pointers ultimately. So you can create as many labels as you want. So you might have one for production, you might have one for latest, you might have one for dev, you might have one for staging, you might have one for some feature branch. And then you define to which GitHub, which Git commit, which Git branch, or which Git tag that label points to. So that is a dynamic mapping, and you can update that and change that as you wish. And what Cerbos Hub then does is, when a commit comes in, it works out which label, if that build passes, it points to that particular commit or that reference. And then when you deploy the decision points in your stack, be it the service, the container, or the WASM point, you define which label that decision point should receive policies for. So in the case where you wanted to have your production environment that maybe is a tag, let's say, you like a tag a commit and like this is your production deploy, or a branch even, your label file, your mapping file would say, okay, the Cerbos Hub label production points to the tag production or the branch production. So only when CI passes and those labels match, those references match, do the policy changes get pushed out to those particular environments. So you could run production, staging, dev, local, edge, whatever, your different environments. And all you need to do is in your configuration file for your decision points, just tell it which label for it to look out for, or which label for it to subscribe to changes to. So rolling back and those kind of things is just another commit to your repo that you're used to. And then all the connected, all the registered decision points will receive the updates as and when need be, kind of as you're used to. And that label file is just another asset in your Git repo, thus itself is versionable. And thus can evolve and change and go with the whole GitOps philosophy.
Oh, really cool. Deployment labels. I think, yeah, just one more example of just how you use metadata and abstract away all of that complexity and just make it more usable. Yeah, really interesting. So for people who are listening to this and want to get started using Cerbos Hub, how would you recommend they get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So we always say recommend just the best way to get started is go and try out the playground. So you can get started, just go to cerbos.dev, and there'll be a link in the description of this episode as well, I'm sure. And then that will take you through directly into Cerbos Hub. When you land on the Cerbos Hub's homepage, the very first thing we prompt you with is, hey, go and open up this existing sort of reference demo playground that we have. And that playground has some example policies loaded into it, and you can start iterating and evolving those to match your requirements until you get to something that is a bit more aligned with what your requirements are. And if you manage to model your requirements, great, you can go to the next step, which is going actually create a whole workspace which sets up the CI pipeline, connects to a Git repo that you have, etc. But the best place to start is just go straight into a playground and start playing with it ultimately, and try and model your authorization requirements using Cerbos policies.
All right, so there you have it, folks, fresh off the oven. We got Cerbos. Go and check it out. I think it's really cool the way that Alex presented it today. And I think it's definitely going to simplify a lot of the issues around authorization. If you had them, it's time to say goodbye to all of them. So what really stands out, I think, in terms of just how it focuses on performance and how it enables collaboration. I think these two really stood out for me, and just how it really blends into your existing workflow as well. If you're already on your journey, advancing in cloud native, GitOps, CI/CD, platform engineering, then Cerbos is going to fit right in, whether you're getting started or I think if you're more advanced and you've got more complex problems, I think Cerbos is something you should you should look into. So thanks so much, Alex. But before you go, got a couple of questions to get to know you a bit more. So I want to ask, could you name one, could be a tech company or a tech product, it could be a software, it could be hardware device, anything at all that you've been using that inspires you, something that you love, you being CPO, Chief Product Officer as well. I'm curious to know what product or products inspire you these days.
Yeah, I would say completely away from the world of authorization, and just like my own, scratch my own itch or whatever phrase you want to use there, that I'm really interested in is actually the home automation space. So I spend a lot of time winding my wife up with all sorts of smart stuff inside of our house, say buttons and switches and such. But going with my kind of core philosophy that everything should be open source, I'm a massive fan of something called Home Assistant, if you haven't heard of it, which is an open source home automation system and that you can run on a Raspberry Pi or something inside of your house. It connects to your existing smart devices, and then kind of how that plugs into the wider ecosystem of services and APIs and such. And there's now people doing crazy stuff with LLMs where you can have much more interactive discussions and do voice detection and such to basically replace your existing Alexas or Google Homes with something that's fully self-hosted that you own and control. Obviously ties in with Cerbos there. That whole project, that whole ecosystem is amazing, and I highly recommend you go and check it out.
What's the name again?
Home Assistant.
Okay, it's open source, is it?
It is.
All right, cool. What's your favorite source for finding out what's new and happening in tech?
Ooh, so if you asked me like a year ago, I would have probably said, Hacker News, etc. But the one that I spend more time looking at is daily.dev. I have it as my like new tab in my browser. So unfortunately, every time I open a new tab, I usually get distracted by something. But I don't know what magic they're doing behind with the algorithm and such. But everything it recommends to me is kind of spot on. And that's sort of one of the places that I go and look, and also just listen to a lot of podcasts and such. I would say is the other one.
Interesting. I haven't heard of this. I'm sorry,
No worries.
got a bad throat. I want to ask maybe a last question.
Mhm.
Sorry. What's the open source project you spent the most time with?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, outside of work, definitely Home Assistant. I think the one I spend the most time with now, um, we use gRPC a lot with Cerbos, and there's a great company and open source project out there called Build a Buff, which or Buff Build, which is makes kind of the gRPC ecosystem and the workflow and the developer experience around it much saner, let's say, than maybe some of these original gRPC projects. So definitely go worth checking it out. Connect RPC is their kind of implementation of gRPC, which we're using extensively inside of Cerbos, and I kind of look to them and how they approach, how they do their open source, how they do their documentation, etc. is a really kind of good standard to aspire to. It's quite niche, it's quite in the weeds, but it's a really fascinating project and ecosystem they're building there.
Oh, it's really neat. Yeah, sounds awesome. Yeah, I'm still recovering from a flu, so yeah, got a sudden uh, this
There's
thing.
something horrible going around at the moment, so hope you feel better.
Yeah, thanks. It was lovely talking to Alex, and wish you the best with the Cerbos Hub. And hope to have you again after a while when something big comes by and you guys are up to something cool. Definitely come back again and tell us about it.
Absolutely, I'd love to.
All right. Thanks all of our viewers and listeners for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.